Hello, and thank you for watching my video presentation, Dispatches from the Hermit Kingdom, three of among the very strangest days of my life in the DPRK. My visit occurred between June 20th and 22nd, 2017, and I am Mark Allenbaugh. I'm currently producing this video in the city of Yanji, Jilin Province, China. So the video, there will be actually three video presentations. The first basically there will be three: where, what, and why. The first that I'm doing here is where did I go, an overview of where I was, and also provide you some history with regarding the DPRK, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, which commonly is known as North Korea. Then in the second video presentation will be what. What did I see? Where exactly did I go? What did I experience? And then the third is more kind of a philosophical reflection on why the hell I went. Obviously, a lot of questions about why I went. I would be lying if I said it wasn't because it was dangerous and adventurous. I went largely because it was crazy and dangerous. And I have the opportunity, since I've been living in China, very close to the DPRK the last several months. But also I was very curious, and I'll get into that more, very curious about what I have read and seen about the DPRK. I've been coming to China, for example, for 13 years, and I fell in love with China back in 2004, which was the first time I arrived. And it was nothing like I had expected, because it was nothing like the way it's represented in the States and Western media. And that attracted me to China. I figured, and it's brought me back to China because it's so different from what we see and experience. But this presentation isn't about China. I could spend years talking about China. It's about the DPRK, and I've always suspected that the DPRK is quite a bit different than what we see and read in the West. And in fact, it is. A lot of it is accurate, though. I'll say that. It's a poor country, as we'll see. But it is a viable country, and it's very different. Not, at least in my experience, not nearly as dangerous as it's presented, nor as poor, at least in the area that I was at. And there seems to be a lot of opportunity and a hell of a lot of surprises. Not to keep you in I'll just let this, you will see and you will meet Americans that live in the DPRK and own businesses there and have a very strong relationship with the local government, and more importantly, the local people, as our de facto ambassadors to the DPRK, since the United States does not maintain an embassy there. At any rate, so without further ado, I'd like to, we'll start this presentation. Where did I go? And also provide you a bit of history about the DPRK. So the first thing is, let's kind of get a feel for, here we can see on the map where it is. Obviously, it's between Japan and China. North Korea is right above, wait for it, South Korea. But it has about 25 million people approximately. But how big is it relative to the U.S.? Well, I'm on a website called thetruesize.com, where you can actually drag and drop countries over other countries to get a sense for how big or small they are. So we obviously a lot smaller than the United States, maybe about a third of the size of California. I now live in Ohio, so it's bigger than Ohio. Maybe if you put Ohio and all of Lake Erie together, it's approximately about that size in terms of geographical size. Bigger than most South American countries. I'm going to take it over, though, move over to, what did I do here? Excuse me. I'm trying to go too fast. I'm going to move it over here to Australia. You can kind of get a feel for it. And why Australia? Because it's about the same size of population as Australia. And we could see Australia dwarfs the DPRK. It could fit easily into New South Wales. the DPRK is comprised of 9 provinces. The province that we hear most about, though, is down here where Pyongyang, the capital of North Korea, is located. I spent, as we'll see, all of my time up here in the Rasan province. The Rasan province is in turn comprised of 2 counties, Rajin and Sanbong. I spent most of my time in Rajin, but also visited Sanbong, where, as you'll see, there's a casino there. There are actually 4 casinos in this part of North Korea, with a 5th one being built. Full of surprises. Okay, so let's go back now to North Korea, kind of orient you. Here's a probably easier to see and read map just from, I took this from Google Maps. And now I'm live on Google Maps in the satellite mode. And I'm going to zoom in here so we can see. I've been spending a lot of time in Shenyang, the capital of the Liaoning province here in China, currently in Yanji, which is part of the Yanbian region. This part of China is known, by the way, as the Korean Autonomous Zone. Autonomous means it's self-governing, and it pretty much is. It's a province, but a special province in China, primarily because it's not a lot of Chinese, ethnic Chinese live here. Obviously, there are ethnic Chinese, but not a lot. The predominant ethnicity here in the Yanbian region is Korean, which isn't surprising. It's right next to Korea. So, I'll zoom in just a little bit more here. So here in Yanbian, I'm going to switch back to, just so it's easier to see, to the regular map mode. So here's Yanbian, where I'm at. Again, Yanji is a city within this region. They probably should call it Yanji on this map. I'm not sure why it's Yanbian, but at any rate, take this road over here, drive over the top of North Korea, come on down through Hunchun, interesting city in and of itself. It's the last stop on the high-speed railway from China. Very Russian city, even though it's in China, because here is Russia. It's obviously a lot of Russians in this part of China. So here's what's also interesting about this part of the world is the proximity between North Korea, China, and Russia. And something that's interesting to notice is what happens to China here as it comes down this little inland peninsula, if you will. It gets smaller, 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 smaller. Almost makes it, this is the Pacific Ocean out here. You would think that the Chinese would want to keep this so they open so they'd actually have access to the ocean, but for whatever reason, it stops here. Tumengong is where China ends, and it ends actually in the middle of the Tumen River. You'll see in my next presentation some pictures I was able to take of this region. I was able to visit it on my last day. So then once China ends here, it's just Russia here to the north and DPRK here to the south. This dotted line here represents this province. This is the Rasan province. This is Rasan, the city I spent most of my time in Sanbong, which I briefly visited my last day. So the crossing is actually here at the Tumen River. And before I talk about that, just to give you a little brief history or some interesting tidbits about the Tumen River, which does serve as the de facto, does serve as the border between China and North Korea, is right up here towards the north, a place called Tumen City that I've spent some time in. And it's right here, as you'll see, Tumen City on the China side. There's also another crossing here that you can go, that foreigners apparently can go into. Obviously, though, I'll tell you why in a minute. It's better don't go in this way. If you're visiting DPRK, go in where I went. Do not go in this way because it's going to be a rough drive for you to find any civilization out of here. But at any rate, this is a very rural part of North Korea, but this is where, when North Koreans escape DPRK, this is generally where they escape, is right in this area. The reason being is the Tumen River here, as you can see, is very narrow and very shallow, and it freezes solid in the winter where you can walk right over. I have visited this region and actually have stepped over into the DPRK away from guards. At least they didn't shoot me when I did, because it's the border is almost non-existent here. It's in many places it's just a cattle fence, not even a barbed wire fence. So why aren't more North Koreans escaping out of here? Well, for one, we don't know really how many, or at least I don't. It's kind of not a state secret, but it's nothing that people keep track of. But the other reason, as we're going to learn, is at least this part of North Korea isn't that bad, and things have been improving despite the sanctions in North Korea. But also the geography. It's very difficult to get to this part of North Korea up here. Why aren't more escaping down this way? I'm not sure. Maybe they are, but when we read about in the West, most of the escapes occur up here by Tumen City. And I do know that there are many North Korean refugees in this part of China, here in Yanbian, and also out in Shenyang, where I've been living, which is way over here. And Chengchun also. We're going to talk about Chengchun here in a second. So before I get into where I went exactly in, and I'm going to get more detail where exactly I was within the Rasan province, I'm going to just provide you with a little bit of history behind North Korea and why this is. So back in World War II, as we know, at the end of World War II, the Allies, which primarily were the three big Allies, us, the United States, Great Britain, or the UK, and the Soviet Union, Russia now, but at that time it was the Soviet Union. At the end of World War II, remember, World War II didn't end all at once. First, first Germany surrendered in May of 1945, May 7th, 1945, and then later in August 1945, the Japanese also surrendered. So what happened is, before Germany surrendered, there was a conference in Tehran, Iran, the capital of Iran, between with Stalin, who was the leader of the Soviet Union at that time, Churchill for the UK, and Roosevelt for us. And they agreed basically on how to divvy up the world at the end of the war. And as we all well know about Eastern Europe, most of the Eastern European countries, like Poland and Czechoslovakia and Hungary, went to the Soviet Union. They did not become part of the Soviet Union, but they became part of something called the Eastern Bloc, where they were satellite states for the Soviet Union. They nominally governed themselves, but they were heavily influenced by the Soviet Union, both economically and certainly politically. And as we know, Germany itself was cut in half. There was East Germany and West Germany. East Germany went to the Soviet bloc, or the Eastern Bloc, and West Germany went to us, to the other allies. Even Berlin, the capital of Germany at the time, was also split into East and West Berlin. Well, the same agreement was made over here in the Pacific Theater between the Allies. North Korea was given to the Soviets, and South Korea to the United States. So why that? What happened here? Well, generally when we study World War II history, we're focused mainly in Europe, and then with respect to Japan, it's just the United States fighting against Japan and getting Japan out of a bunch of islands. Well, it's not to the south of Japan here, like Okinawa and some of the other islands that were occupied by the Japanese at the time. But what's not discussed too much, certainly not emphasized, is where else the Japanese occupied that, where the U.S. did not invade. and that is here in China and Korea. The Japanese began back in the 30s to, actually in 1905, had invaded North Korea and had occupied North Korea even before World War One. The reason being is it needed raw material. There's not a lot of natural resources in Japan. Certainly not oil that they need to operate their armies and navies, and certainly not enough natural, like iron ore, to build the ships, the bullets, and the tanks. So they needed to find natural resources somewhere else. While Korea at that time, which was unified, provided an opportunity for that. Korea has a lot of natural resources and a lot of people, and they enslaved them and made them work for, they being the Japanese, made them work for the Japanese juggernaut to build up the emperor's military at the time. The Japanese had also done the same thing to a place called Manchuria. Manchuria is essentially all of northeast China here. Specifically, it is 3 provinces: Heilongjiang, Jilin, and Liaoning, where I've been living. And that's all called, considered Manchuria proper. Sometimes Manchuria also is said to include Inner Mongolia, but classically it's just these 3 provinces together. So the Japanese had invaded and occupied all of this, and they were still occupying all of this area at the end of World War II. The problem that presented to the Allies is that it provided a lifeline, a natural or a resource lifeline to the Japanese emperor and to his military. So we needed to get rid of that, to cut that off. So we decided to do a 2-prong, or arguably a 3-prong approach. We're all well aware of what happened at Hiroshima. Well, and as well as at Nagasaki, we dropped a couple of bombs on them. And we're taught in the United States that that was what caused the Japanese to surrender. But what we ignore is the contribution of the Soviet Union. And if you ask kids from Russia what caused the Japanese to surrender, it wasn't so much the nuclear bombs. That certainly contributed, but what you'll hear from them is the main reason why the Japanese surrendered is because Uncle Joe Stalin, had agreed to, within 90 days after Germany surrendered, to invade Manchuria and then ultimately Korea, to kick the occupying army out and therefore cut off the Japanese from having any natural resources. And so that's exactly what he did. Hours before we dropped the atomic bomb on the city of Nagasaki, which was August 9th, 1945, Uncle Joe and his forces came in, 1.5 million of them, to fight about 750,000 Japanese occupying forces, came in down through Russia and into Manchuria to kick out the Japanese. And obviously they were successful, and successful rather quickly. It just took them a few weeks, come all the way down here and boot the Japanese army out of Manchuria as well as Korea. And and then that ultimately is what caused the Japanese to surrender. Obviously, the bombs, certainly, the atomic bombs certainly was an impetus. But what we forget again, that dropping those atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki did nothing to cut off the lifeline that the Japanese military had with respect to the natural resources in Manchuria and Korea. So it was Uncle Joe that actually did that for us as part of his agreement. So one of the things, too, I mentioned the city of Chuncheon. If you have ever heard of a great movie that I highly suggest, The Last Emperor. It's about Emperor Puyi, who was the last dynasty in China was the Qing dynasty. And Puyi was the last emperor. The Japanese had installed him here in Chuncheon, and they had made a puppet state called Manchukuo. And that was basically designed to keep the Chinese population in check while the Japanese occupied the area. It was to give the Chinese some semblance that lived up there, or at least the Manchus, that to give them the fictitious idea that they actually had their own country, and the Japanese weren't all that bad. It was just a puppet state, just like the Soviets had done in the Eastern Bloc, and as the Soviets ultimately did here in North Korea. They're just puppet states. They're beholden to the parent state. So at any rate, Joe Stalin kicked the Japanese out of here, and ultimately, if you watch The Last Emperor, you know that Puyi becomes dethroned, his fake empire goes away, and then the Chinese Communist Party comes in and regains control of this part of China, and you can watch the movie to see the rest of that. So at any rate, so now after Stalin kicks the Japanese out of China and Korea, or Manchuria in Korea, it's agreed that because his forces still were here occupying, they were mainly here in the north, it was decided that right here along the 38th parallel, that they would that this part of Korea would fall to the Soviet sphere, and this part of the Korean peninsula would be for the U.S. and UK. And as we well know, we still have about 30,000 troops here in South Korea along the DMZ, the demilitarized zone, which, as everybody points out, is probably the most ironic term in the world because it's the most heavily militarized part of the world, the most heavily militarized border in the world right now. So at any rate, that's just a little bit of history about how we got North Korea. So then what happened after North Korea was assigned over to the Soviet Union, Uncle Joe picked a guy named Kim Il-sung to lead North Korea. And why did he pick Kim? Well, during World War II and even before World War II, when the Japanese were occupying here, there obviously were guerrilla forces, both Korean and Chinese, fighting the Japanese. And Kim Il-sung actually was living here in this part of Manchuria and had made a name for himself as a bit of a guerrilla warrior and leader in fighting the occupying Japanese forces. So he got the attention of Stalin. He was respected by enough Koreans at that time where it made sense because of his military acumen, his background, the respect that some of the Koreans had for him, to make him the first president of North Korea. And that's how Kim Il-sung and the Kim dynasty began. And that's how we got where we are, frankly, today. So that's just a little bit of background to provide you about North Korea, how it got there, and why it, not necessarily why it is today, but at least how it came into existence. Okay, so now quickly back to where exactly I went, and then this will be the end of my part one of my presentation, but just bear with me about another 2-3 minutes. So I'm going to kind of give you a preview of the next segment of the next part of my presentation. So again, I cross over the DPRK here. You leave China. There's a customs house on this side of the Tumen River. You basically check out of China on this side. You take a bus or drive. I was able to drive with an American across the border here, and then on this side is the immigration house for the DPRK, where you go in and you present your visa, or you present your passport, etc. They do not stamp passports for Americans. They'll stamp a piece of paper for you, but they will not stamp the passport with the DPRK stamp. I didn't know that until I was actually there, because I thought, well, how cool would this be to have a DPRK passport or stamp in my passport? Well, I don't have that coolness. They just don't do it, and it's probably just because they don't like us. It's just some slight, I guess, but no big deal to me. What I suggest, if you do enter, the reason why I say to enter here and not the other side over by Tumen City is because you're going to have less of a rough drive to get to Rason. And it's a rough drive. You're going to want to use the restroom here before you get going, because this road The road on China side is just like in the States, very well paved, no potholes, beautiful. As a matter of fact, it's better than most roads in the United States. That changes once we get to North Korea here. It's a very windy, bumpy, arduous road. So you take this road all the way down. It's about an hour and a half drive from the border to Rason, the city here. So I'm just going to zoom in to the city. Your bladder's going to take a beating, is my point. So the first thing you do, and we'll see, is check into the hotel and all that stuff. But I'm not going to jump ahead here. I'm just going to point out a couple of things here. One are these 3 piers. These are actually piers. They don't get a lot of traffic today because of the sanctions, but they have cranes and whatnot there for loading and offloading containers. Fairly large container vessels can go in here. There is an active coal trade, which I've found surprising, since there's supposed to be a sanction on North Korea for selling coal to anybody. Well, I guess technically they're not. This pier here is the coal pier, pier number 3. What I saw, and they didn't hide it from me, they actually took me to these piers to see everything. I just couldn't take pictures. Their coal, it comes in from Russia by rail, and is offloaded here and then unloaded to a bunch of ships that then take it down to Southeast Asia for sale. So it's the North Koreans technically are not selling their coal to anybody, but they're certainly making money off the logistics and transportation business of the coal trade. Just a minor aside that I thought was surprising and interesting as a way to get around these sanctions. So this is downtown Rason. So quickly I'm going to switch here to the satellite view. And one thing I'm just going to point out here, kind of a personal mystery was solved for me when I visited the DPRK, and that has to do with blue roofs. If you've ever been to China or Southeast Asia, or as it turns out, DPRK, you're going to see a lot of blue roofs. Blue roofs everywhere, especially on commercial buildings. I've been coming to China for 13 years, and I've asked literally hundreds of people, why are there so many blue roofs? And I've even asked government officials, why are there so many blue roofs? What's with blue? Do Chinese like blue? I thought Chinese liked red. Is there something lucky about it? What's it supposed to represent? Nobody has ever had the answer. Nobody. And it's just, usually people think it's absurd to even ask the question, like, why do you care? Well, that's me. It's not so much I care, I'm just curious. Well, an American living in the DPRK answered the question for me finally. And apparently the roofs, when they are manufactured, the default color is blue because it's the cheapest pigment to use to paint these roofs. You can also use red, as you see. It's either the same price or a little bit more expensive, but blue is the default. It's what everybody uses. If you want any other color, apparently it's very expensive. It takes a lot of time, so that's why you don't see other colors. It's either blue or red. That's it, and it's like 90% blue, but now I figured out why, because that's the default. Blue's cheap, and that's what everyone's going to go for. So I can die a fulfilled life now knowing that. So downtown again, downtown Rason, and point out just a few things you're going to see in the next video. One, this is my hotel here. This is the Foreigners Hotel where, surprise, surprise, all the foreigners stay. And they're only allowed to stay there and a few other designated places. This up here, zoom in a little bit more, oops. You'll see these things and some interesting shadows. Looks like people standing there. And in fact, they are, but they're about 100 feet tall or more. Those are statues. This is Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il. I got a picture in front of it. You'll see it next time. This is a very, very large theater where we were treated on the first day to a bunch of the local school children giving just a knockout performance. You're going to see some video of that. This is kind of like the main thoroughfare in town. It's a beautiful view all the way down to the ocean, or to the bay, I should say, port. This is a park, a walkway you'll see here. There's a water park here, the big water slide, that's what that is. This is actually a three-dimensional theater. You're not going to see any pictures of that. It was closed when I was there, and I didn't have time to go anyway. A roller rink, an outdoor roller rink. It looks more like a BMX racing thing circuit, which is very interesting. And by the way, you see everything is very brown. That's because this was probably taken during the winter, this satellite image. Everything was, you'll see in the pictures, very lush and very green when I was there. So please don't think that this is how North Korea looks all the time, brown, barren, and desolate. At least not in North Korea, not in the Rasan area, and not during the summer. I'm going to point this out here. You're going to see a little bit more of this. This is a warship, a very interesting looking warship. And I actually got a picture in the distance of it. And I did it, quote unquote, accidentally. But I saw this there, and I was very surprised to see, I wasn't surprised to see a warship here, but what kind and shape it is. You know, obviously this is straight down, so you can't see it from the side. There are these new ships, and for those of you who are in the armed forces, especially in the Navy, will know what I'm talking about. They're called littoral something or other, and they have, they look very, very futuristic, and the Navy has just launched a couple of them over the last few years. They're essentially stealth ships. They have a very, not angular, but a very unusual shape to them to reduce their radar profile. And they're littoral something or other because they're designed to operate in very close to the shore in very shallow water. Well, this, you'll see a very bad picture of it, but this looks just like one of those littoral ships. Obviously not a U.S. ship, but obviously a DPRK ship. And this I think is just a freighter. That's probably just a dry dock. When that it looks exactly like it's in dry dock there. And this may look like it's in dry dock too. That also maybe looks like an old time destroyer. I saw military. I couldn't take any pictures of them, obviously, but I did see military, but not. I mean, they look more just. They didn't look real military to me. It's just a bunch of guys, and they look more like street cops, more like just for civilian affairs, and not anything that we would associate with actual military deployment in the West. But at any rate, it was just the point of that ship there, how futuristic and new it looked. It never left. I don't even know if it's operable. Obviously, if it's been sitting there, I don't know how long these pictures are on Google, how old they are. But that thing, for all I know, is completely inoperable. I never saw any military ships going in and out. I never saw any military vehicles of any kind. And I went to a lot of places up here. Now, obviously, I wasn't all over North Korea. I was in a very small section. But I was there for 3 days, out of my hotel room by 6:30 a.m. each morning, and was highly observant. Very little military. I see more military in China, which is also very little, and I see most military in the States. So, at any rate, I have digressed. This is going to end part one of my presentation, and part two will be, what did I see?